I don't believe it makes any sense at all. I don't think the markets believe it makes any sense at all. We've lost trillions of dollars of market capitalization since President Trump began on this. The stated purposes of the tariff, which are many stated purposes, are not going to be well served by the tariff. By stated purposes, I mean the various explanations that have been given in justification, for example, to end the trade deficit or to rebuild the manufacturing sector or to renegotiate the trading system or to punish China. These are variously given as explanations. I don't think they stand up to scrutiny. The international trade order, which is the global division of labor, we could say, is there because trade is a mutually beneficial activity, as Adam Smith taught already in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. History has borne that out. The United States has benefited from the open trading system. The developing countries have benefited enormously from the open trading system. Causing this kind of instability by breaking international trade relations will lower living standards in the United States if this is maintained. It will create many problems for short-term macroeconomic management by the Fed, which the Fed has pointed out and is the reason why President Trump has been attacking the Fed vociferously in recent days. They're just doing their job, pointing out that these tariffs are going to make matters more complicated.
Because of that, do you see that the tariffs will actually have to be abandoned, that some compromise with the major trading partners in the world, like the European Union and China, will have to be achieved?
Yes, that's already happened because just in the first days of the so-called reciprocal tariffs, they were basically suspended because the financial markets began to react very dangerously. Not only the stock market, which fell worldwide, but the bond market, which started to fall in price and meaning to rise in interest rates very significantly, signified the fact that there was an aversion to U.S. denominated assets, including the Treasury bills. And that is what provoked a so-called suspension of the tariffs. In other words, the markets worldwide gave this a very strong thumbs down. Trump backed down immediately. It said that his lead protectionist advisor, Peter Navarro, who somehow claims a PhD at Harvard, but he certainly didn't take my class in international trade. He was away from the White House, and supposedly other advisors rushed in to see President Trump and said, this has to be suspended. So he suspended these tariffs. There's lots of talk about how we're going to reach trade agreements with different parts of the world. I think all of it is to signify that the tariffs that were announced as these reciprocal tariffs are never going to really happen. But in the meantime, we're in a real trade war with China. By real trade war, I mean China is not going to back down. Trump has not backed down. We basically have a break in this major trade relationship between the two countries. Trump partly backed down immediately by saying these things, my iPhone, that's going to come in tariff-free because the consumers were starting to freak out and Apple was starting to freak out. You're going to break your best consumer goods, Mr. President? And he said, no, we'll give an exception for this one. We'll give an exception for that one.
So you don't see that the whole tariff policy is a clever strategy to decouple from China eventually?
Well, decoupling from China, to my mind, is not a clever strategy at all because I regard U.S.-China trade as a win-win proposition. It became known as a win-lose proposition, where China was winning and the United States was losing for strange reasons. Uh, the U.S. Has made a lot of income gain nationally by having strong relations with China, by producing a lot of goods in China. Silicon Valley has invented a lot of products, and those are then manufactured in China. And that's a win-win. China has bought into a lot of intellectual property, so-called service income of the United States. The United States has gotten a lot of consumer goods very inexpensively produced from China. Of course, there are losers in trade relations as well. No doubt, some companies that are in the direct line of imports from China have reduced their production, and jobs have been lost in those sectors. But huge gains have been made in other sectors. And if we were a rational political system, we would say open trade is benefiting America enormously. Yes, there are some who are hurting, and we should make sure that the winners help to compensate the losers. This is what we teach by the second day of trade theory, that overall the economy gains, but winners do need to help compensate the losers so that the winning is across the board, or what we say Pareto improving, rather than dividing society. But America is not very good at that. We don't do redistribution. We leave losers to their fate, losers in quotation marks. And Trump has appealed to them in both the 2016, well, actually in all three election campaigns. And he won a lot of swing states in the industrial Midwest on the argument that you're being hurt from the outside rather than being hurt by our domestic policy shortcomings.
But listening to Trump, he argues that the trade deficit with China, for example, but also with other countries, is of serious concern. The loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States needs to be addressed, and also some unfair trade practices by China and others about subsidies and unfair plagiarism and the pinching and stealing of international property and so on and so on. Does he have a point, or does he have no point whatsoever?
He has a very funny idea, and the idea is that the trade deficit is a measure of cheating by other countries. Now, I'm a macroeconomist, and I teach what's called an identity. In other words, a statistical relationship that has to be, and that is that the trade deficit measures how much more we spend as a country compared with how much we earn as a country. And so if you go to the store and use your credit card and spend money you haven't earned to buy something from the store, you run a trade deficit and you run up your credit card debt. In Trump's world, you should be blaming that store for selling you things rather than saying, my God, maybe I should cut down on my indebtedness. I should watch my bank balance. I should not run up credit card debts. Instead, I should blame all the stores that I'm buying from. That's Donald Trump's vision of the world. It's frankly absurd to say that because the United States spends $1 trillion more per year than our GDP, in essence, or our GNP, technically speaking.
So the American consumer is to be blamed. Is that what you say?
Well, the one to be blamed actually is Washington in the following way. Our government is like our national credit card. The government runs a huge deficit. It's almost 7% of our GDP. It's unbelievably large. The government's running up debt. The government borrows on the markets and then transfers payments to Americans that are not coming from tax revenues, they're coming from borrowing. And then Americans, both companies and households, spend. So the American consumer is basically using that. They may not realize it, but the government's their credit card. It's our national credit card. We've run up 100% of our national income in debt. So if you as an individual run up debt equal to your 1 year's income, that's equivalent to what the United States has done. Is it manageable to pay that? Yes, but the interest costs are getting pretty steep. They're about 3% of GDP just on interest now, and that will rise over time. So what has happened is the government is used as a credit card. We spend more as a nation than we produce and earn. And as a result of that, we have this chronic trade deficit with the rest of the world, which Donald Trump then has inventively blamed the rest of the world. It's incredible. It's a little bit bizarre. You can look up the following if you do technically exactly the right calculations. You can add up how much we spend. That's our consumption by the private economy, plus the consumption by government, plus the investment by the private economy, plus the investment by government, and you subtract off the national income, which is the gross national product, and you will get exactly the current account deficit, which is the comprehensive measure of how much we spend abroad minus how much we sell abroad in goods and services. So it's not even an analogy, it's literally the definition of that comprehensive imbalance. But Trump has inventively said, oh, our current account imbalance, our spending income imbalance is the fault of everyone else. Kind of bizarre. The markets don't buy it. The rest of the world is befuddled. The economics community is scratching its head saying this is pretty weird stuff. But we also have one person rule right now. And so I should just say something about that, which is that our trade system should be a matter of legislation as well as international negotiation. We actually have global treaty arrangements that establish the WTO and that were negotiated with other governments about what the tariff should be. We've ripped all of that up. But we also have, under the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the clear statement that taxation, including tariffs, which is the tax on imports, is the responsibility of Congress. If you go to Article 2, which is the executive branch, there is no responsibility at all of the executive branch for setting tariffs. So already something is weird. Now, of course, what is weird you can find out directly by going to whitehouse.gov and clicking on the executive orders about trade. And they all start out in the same way. It says, by the powers invested in me as President of the United States and under the following emergency legislation, I declare an emergency. Trump is declaring a national emergency. That's not the kind of country I grew up in, where a single person declared a national emergency. And what is the emergency? Well, it turns out it's a trade deficit that we've run for 20 years. That's not an emergency. That is a problem, but a problem that should be dealt with by the legislative branch, the Congress, and the President of the United States by law, not by emergency decree.
Yeah, I think you have a full point that Congress is not really standing up to its responsibilities and has abdicated responsibility to the executive. But there have been complaints about other trading partners for many years, well before Trump. You know, I mentioned the subsidy culture of China, but also other countries, the stealing of intellectual properties, and so on and so on. How do you address that? Because that seems to be quite valid.
Well, I don't think it's valid in a couple of senses. First, the United States abuses its trade policies all over the place, not just with Trump, but anytime it wants. So there's already, yes, abuses by the United States and by others. Simply pointing the finger at others misses the point. And the point is that we created a system called the World Trade Organization. The United States actually led the creation of WTO, and we created a system where if countries are violating the terms of WTO, they can take measures against those other countries. And if the other countries say, no, no, I'm not violating the rules of WTO, there is an adjudication at the WTO. And if the adjudication rules for one country or another, that gives a right of response to those countries. For example, anti-dumping duties or other measures. And if the country on the losing side of that disagreement feels that the adjudication was mistaken, there's an appellate court. Now, the United States has broken that process. Amazingly, it has blocked filling the appellate court of WTO. So it has said we're not going to have an international standard to judge. We're going to be the judge and jury of anyone we want, rather than going to an international tribunal to decide these things, which is how properly this should be done. The United States points fingers at others. And this, to my mind, is seriously wrong. I often say, by the way, in many different dimensions of foreign policy, I subscribe to Jesus's foreign policy, if I may say so, because in the Gospels, Jesus says, why do you point to the mote in the other's eye when you have a beam in your own eye? And of course, what Jesus is preaching there is don't be hypocritical. Clean up your own act. And this, I believe, is a general principle for keeping the world safe, but it absolutely applies to trade policy as well. We're very good at pointing out the mote in the other's eyes, but when it comes to our own actions, we don't even want to discuss it, and we certainly don't want a judge to judge. We want to be the judge and jury. We don't want the proper international procedures that we help to establish. We don't want to be judged. And that is a sign, in my view, that we're not abiding by the rules of the game.
Thank you. Let's move on to some other geopolitical issues beyond tariffs and economic policy. The Ukraine war is still continuing. The Trump administration is now putting pressure on both Russia and Ukraine to arrive at a ceasefire, but they have done that for quite a few weeks now without much success. So today we hear the new momentum seems to have developed. You're quite critical of the Trump administration regarding its tariff and economic policy. Are you equally critical of Trump regarding its Ukraine policy?
No, I think on this one, Trump has it right. And he said it in a very Trumpian way. He said, this is Biden's war. This isn't my war. This is a loser. I'm getting out of it. I don't want to be shackled with Biden's war. Now, you can unpack a lot of that.
I thought it was Putin's war.
No,
Biden didn't invade, I believe. It was Vladimir Putin who invaded Ukraine.
Right. Well, you know, I take a different view of this because I've watched this close up for 35 years. I was on the economic advisory team of President Mikhail Gorbachev. I was on the economic advisory team of President Boris Yeltsin, and I was on the economic advisory team of Ukraine's president, Leonid Kuchma. So I worked with both countries very close up, and they were not in any way in conflict for a long time. I believe, it's not a popular view, I admit, but I've been there and I've seen it. I believe the United States actually walked Ukraine and Russia into this war. Not suddenly, not in 2022, but going back 30 years.
That was a deliberate strategy or just happened?
It was a kind of bluff. What the U.S. wanted, and it was decided as early as 1994, was that the U.S. would push NATO enlargement first to Central Europe, then to Eastern Europe, then into the former Soviet Union, right up against Russia's borders in Ukraine and in Georgia, the South Caucasus country. And I watched that process close up. I remember because I was a guest of Helmut Kohl in 1991. I was a guest of Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, in 1991 in Berlin because I was a lead advisor of the Polish government at the time. They promised to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin NATO was not going to expand, and it was not going to take advantage of Gorbachev's unilateral end of the Soviet military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, which Gorbachev unilaterally ended, saying the Cold War's over, we don't need a military alliance aiming at the West. And at that time, actually, even the date, February 7th, 1990, James Baker III and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the US Secretary of State and the German Foreign Minister, said to Gorbachev and publicly, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And Genscher was asked at the time, well, do you mean, Mr. Genscher, not to move into the new eastern part of Germany, which is going to unify with the Federal Republic of Germany? In other words, when the German Democratic Republic would unify, or do you mean more generally? He said, I mean more generally, we're not going to move eastward. And then, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the American security state said, oh, come on, we have no enemies anymore, no one that can confront us. Rather than saying we have no enemies, we should end NATO, they said we have no enemies, we should expand NATO. We should make sure that Russia never returns, Soviet Union never returns, whatever.
Oh, that is, of course, you're right. This is the debate about promises given or not given.
Yes.
Which is very, people have very different attitudes about that and very different opinions. And the claims are, still wishy-washy because no written documents are available, but probably oral promises were made. And also, it is a question whether NATO expansion really should have happened or should not have happened. But even if that all was wrong and we say that was to be criticized, does that justify invading a country and killing civilians and bombing tower blocks and civilian infrastructure and people, of course? So did Putin have perhaps grievances, but then went well beyond to try to satisfy these grievances?
Well, there's one more step of this that's very important. Again, and by the way, on this question of NATO, I encourage people to go to George Washington University National Security Archives online and go to a website called What Gorbachev Heard, because it's got dozens of documents that lay all this out very, very explicitly. It's a wonderful program that George Washington University runs. But what became awful was that in 2008, after NATO had expanded to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic in 1999, and then to 7 more countries in 2004, to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to Bulgaria and Romania, and to Slovakia and Slovenia. So getting pretty far eastward, in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, George W. Bush Jr. insisted NATO will go to Ukraine and to Georgia, surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region. That was the idea that goes all the way back to Brzezinski in the mid-1990s. The Russians said no. Our former CIA director, William Burns, was at that point the US ambassador to Moscow, and he wrote a famous long cable back to Condoleezza Rice, where he said the entire Russian political class is dead set against NATO enlargement to Ukraine because they view it as a national security threat. Now, the next step that's really important is what happened February 22nd, 2014, because that was when the Ukrainian president was overthrown, Viktor Yanukovych. That was quite notable because Yanukovych favored neutrality. He was considered pro-Russian. He did not want to bring Ukraine into NATO. He was elected in 2009, came into office in 2010, and he favored neutrality. He was overthrown on February 22nd, 2014. The Ukrainians that came to power called it the Revolution of Dignity. I call it a coup, a violent coup that the United States actively supported. And I happened to see some of it, sad to say, up close, because the US funded a lot of the coup. And the Russians knew it. They actually intercepted a phone call between somebody who's now my colleague, actually at Columbia, Victoria Nuland. She was at the time the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. She made a call on an open phone to the US Ambassador, Jeffrey Piat, and they talked about in end of January 2014, who would be the next government. And by the way, at that point, Biden was vice president, and he was the one that was going to come seal the deal. It's all on the tape. It's a shocking, shocking call. So my view is, many historians agree with me, others argue the point, but my view is the United States was part of an active regime change operation because they wanted to overthrow a president that opposed neutrality.